So you think your life is tough, do you? Poor diddums. Sitting there in your trendy clothes, doom scrolling through social media, searching for the nearest Wi-Fi point, and waiting in line for your morning double frappuccino caffeine fix. Life is tough, isn't it? But what if I told you that, had you been born some 2,000 years ago as a peasant in ancient Rome, your biggest concerns would not be needing to check Instagram for the gazillionth time, but rather whether you'd have enough mouldy bread to survive the week, if your one-room mud-brick hovel would collapse on your entire family, and whether your scrawny chicken would finally lay at least one bloody egg. Suddenly, the line outside your favorite cafe doesn't look so bad, does it? Welcome back to Ancient Rome Revisited. I'm your host, Marcus Aurelius, son to Marcus Annius Verus, adopted by Hadrian, then by Antonius Pius, before becoming emperor myself at age 39. Now, I know what you might be thinking. What does this old codger know about peasant life in ancient Rome? Well, not much, to be honest, mainly because I was born into Rome's most elite families. And yet, believe it or not, I do know a thing or two about peasant life in ancient Rome, thanks to the fact that I had to rule the peasant class for many years, from lofty heights of my marbled palaces, of course. You can't blame me for being honest now, can you? Okay, with that said, I'm going to take you on a journey back into the gritty, harsh reality of what life was actually like for about 90% of Rome's population. The peasants. Trust me, after watching this video, you'll never complain to your mother about having to do laundry ever again. Before we begin, though, if you love Roman history and want to learn more about the trials and tribulations of the people and the Republic of Rome, then click the subscribe button now, and you'll never miss another episode of Ancient Rome Revisited. If you have just clicked subscribe, then I, Marcus Aurelius, thank you. Okay, let's begin our journey back in time and see why life sucked for peasants in ancient Rome, shall we? The peasant home, where cozy meant cramped. Let's start with where Roman peasants lived, because calling these places homes is being incredibly generous. If you think your studio apartment is small, try living in a single room that's maybe 10 feet by 10 feet with your entire family. Mum, dad, kids, grandparents, and sometimes even the family goat, all sharing the same space. Are you starting to appreciate having your own room yet? If not, then keep watching, kiddo. These weren't the charming rustic cottages you see in period dramas. Roman peasant homes were essentially mud brick boxes with maybe one tiny window, if they were lucky. The walls were made from whatever materials they could scrounge up: mud, straw, wood scraps, and stones. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of a tiny house, except without the Instagram-worthy aesthetic, and with a lot more structural instability. The roof was typically made of thatch, basically dried grass and reeds, which meant it leaked constantly. When it rained, you didn't just get wet outside, you got wet inside too, and forget about insulation. In winter, these homes were freezing cold, and in summer, they were sweltering hot. The Romans hadn't invented central heating for the masses, so peasants had to make do with a small fire in the center of the room. This created its own problems. Smoke filling the entire space because there was no proper chimney, just a hole in the roof if they were fortunate. The floor? Well, it was dirt, of course. Just packed earth, sometimes covered with straw if the family was doing well. Furniture was practically non-existent. Maybe a wooden table if they were lucky, some stools and sleeping mats made of straw. Beds were a luxury item. Most peasants slept on the floor or on simple straw mattresses that were crawling with fleas, lice, and other delightfully awful creatures. Imagine mice crawling through your duvet while you sleep. It's enough to give you nightmares, right? And here's where it gets really grim. There was no plumbing. None. While wealthy Romans enjoyed elaborate bathhouses and running water, peasants had to walk to the nearest well or stream for water, which they'd carry back in the clay pots. As for bathrooms, you either used a communal latrine in town, basically a wooden plank with holes over a pit, or you just went outside. Toilet paper hadn't been invented, so they used stones, leaves, or rags. The smell alone would have been overwhelming, enough to make you modern people vomit, actually. The typical peasant home also doubled as a workplace and storage area. If you were a farmer, you'd store your tools, grain, and maybe some livestock inside during harsh weather. Imagine trying to sleep while sharing your bedroom with chickens flapping all over you and pigs snorting in your face. It gives new meaning to the phrase, working from home, doesn't it? Peasant food, when hangry, was a permanent state. Now let's talk about food. And spoiler alert, it wasn't good. While wealthy Romans were feasting on elaborate banquets with exotic spices, imported delicacies, and multiple courses, peasants were basically surviving on ancient Rome's version of instant ramen, except less tasty and less nutritious. The foundation of a peasant's diet was grain, specifically a type of wheat called emmer. But here's the catch, they couldn't always afford to turn it into bread. Instead, they'd make a porridge called pulse, which was made by boiling grains in water. Think oatmeal, but if oatmeal was made by someone who hated flavor and nutrition. This stuff was so bland that even calling it food is generous. But it filled your stomach and kept you alive, which was pretty much the goal. When peasants could afford bread, it wasn't the soft, fluffy loaves you're used to in today's modern world. The bread peasants ate was coarse, dark, and often mixed with cheaper ingredients like barley, beans, or even sawdust to stretch the grain further. The wealthy Romans looked down on this bread so much they called it black bread, and not in a cool, artisanal way. Meat was an extremely rare luxury. Most peasants might taste meat a few times a year during religious festivals or special occasions. The rest of the time, if they were lucky enough to have protein, it came from eggs, if they owned chickens, milk, if they had a goat, or the occasional fish if they lived near water. More often than not, their protein came from beans and lentils, the ancient world's protein powder, except without the marketing hype you all see today. Vegetables were whatever they could grow in their small plots or forage from the wild. Onions, cabbage, turnips, and leeks. Fruit was seasonal and limited, maybe some olives if they were in the right region, or figs and grapes during harvest time. But forget about having fresh fruit all year round. Food preservation was limited to drying, salting, or fermenting. You might want to give your fridge a big hug the next time you walk past it. Here's something that might shock all you modern health enthusiasts. Peasants rarely ate fresh food. Most of their food was fermented, pickled, or had been sitting around for months. That black bread I mentioned before, it was often moldy. And those vegetables? Probably fermenting in their own juices. This wasn't by choice, it was survival. Without refrigeration, food spoilage was a constant battle. The drinking situation wasn't much better. Water quality was questionable at best, so peasants often drank a diluted wine called posca, basically ancient Gatorade made with vinegar, water, and cheap wine. It was supposed to be refreshing and help prevent disease, but I'm guessing it tasted about as appetizing as it sounds. Meal planning didn't come neatly packaged to you in a nice, colourful box like it is today. Instead, Roman peasants had to ration like crazy, hoping they would have enough food to last them until the next harvest. Famine was a constant threat, and during bad years, peasants would resort to eating tree bark, grass, and anything else that might provide calories. The phrase feast or famine wasn't just an expression, it was literally their reality. Peasant clothing, when fast fashion meant your clothes lasted a decade. Let's move on to fashion, though calling peasant clothing fashion is like calling a cardboard box architecture. Roman peasants didn't have walk-in closets or seasonal wardrobes. Most owned maybe 2 or 3 pieces of clothing total, and they wore them until they literally fell apart. The basic peasant outfit consisted of a tunic, essentially a long, shapeless shirt made from coarse wool or linen. For men, this tunic typically reached to about mid-thigh, while women's tunics were longer, reaching to their ankles. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of wearing the same oversized t-shirt every day for years. Forget about fabric softener with your laundry detergent. The fabrics Roman peasants wore were rough, scratchy, and usually undyed, giving them a natural brown or grey colour. Unlike the wealthy Romans who wore bright colours like purple, red, and gold, peasants were stuck with whatever natural colour their wool or linen happened to be. If they were really lucky, they might have been able to afford some basic plant-based dyes to make their clothes slightly less depressing. But this was a luxury Roman peasants could rarely afford. In colder weather, peasants would add a cloak, basically a large piece of fabric that could be wrapped around the body. This cloak served as an overcoat, blanket, and sometimes even a tent if they had to bunker down outside for the night. Footwear was often non-existent. Many peasants went barefoot year-round, developing thick, calloused feet that could handle rough terrain. If they could afford shoes, they were simple leather sandals or basic boots made from whatever animal hide they could get their hands on. These weren't the comfortable, cushioned shoes that you modern people wear today. They were essentially pieces of leather wrapped around your feet. By now, you might have soiled your own underwear, having listened to How Much Life, such for peasants in ancient Rome. Speaking of which, peasants didn't really wear underwear like you trendy people do today. The concept of underwear didn't exist for peasants. They wore their tunics directly against their skin, which made personal hygiene even more challenging than it already was. If I was you, I wouldn't try to imagine the fabric of a tunic scratching against your private parts. Too late, perhaps. Clothing maintenance was a nightmare for Roman peasants. Without modern washing machines or detergents, cleaning clothes meant beating them against rocks in a stream, using harsh soaps that were rough on both the fabric and the skin. Clothes were mended over and over again until there were more patches than original fabric. When clothing finally became unwearable, it was repurposed as rags, bedding, or even stuffing for walls. The social implications of clothing were huge. You could instantly tell someone's social status by what they wore. Peasants in their rough, patched tunics were immediately recognizable as lower class, while wealthy Romans flaunted their status by wearing fine fabrics, elaborate designs, and expensive accessories. Clothing wasn't just about staying warm and modest. It was a visual representation of your place in Roman society. Women had additional challenges with clothing. They were expected to be modest, which meant their clothing had to cover most of their body, but they also needed practical garments for the physical labor they performed. The result was often hot, uncomfortable clothing that made hard work even harder for women. Peasant work. When work-life balance meant working until you died. Now, let's talk about work, Because if you thought your modern job was stressful and bad, Roman peasant work would make your worst Monday look like a holiday. The concept of a 40-hour work week, vacation days, or retirement didn't exist in ancient Rome. Peasants worked from dawn to dusk, every day, until they were physically unable to continue. Most peasants were farmers, which sounds peaceful until you realize that Roman farming required back-breaking manual labor, day in, day out. No tractors, no mechanized equipment, just you, some basic tools, and endless physical labor. Plowing was done with wooden plows pulled by oxen if you were lucky enough to own them, or by hand if you weren't. Harvesting meant cutting grain by hand with sickles, threshing it by beating it with flails, and carrying heavy loads on your back. The farming calendar dictated your entire life. Spring meant plowing and planting, working in muddy fields from sunrise to sunset. Summer meant tending crops, weeding by hand, and praying to the gods that drought, floods, or pests wouldn't destroy your harvest. Fall meant frantically harvesting everything before winter arrived, working 16-hour days to bring in the crops. Winter meant preparing for the next year, mending tools and trying to survive on whatever food you'd managed to store. But here's the cruel twist. Most peasants didn't even own their land. They were tenant farmers, sharecroppers, or they worked on large estates owned by wealthy Romans. This meant they had to give a huge percentage of their harvest to their landlords, sometimes as much as 50% or more. Imagine working 16-hour days all year round, then having to give half of everything you produced to your wealthy landlord. If not farming, then some peasants worked as laborers in the city, which wasn't much better, to be honest. Construction work meant carrying heavy stones and building materials without modern safety equipment. A fall from a building site often meant death or permanent disability, with no workers' compensation or medical care. Dock workers loaded and unloaded ships by hand, dealing with dangerous cargo and the constant risk of injury. Women peasants faced double duty. They were expected to work alongside men in the fields or workshops, but they also had to manage all the household responsibilities: cooking, cleaning, child rearing, and textile production. Many peasant women spun wool or wove cloth to supplement the family income, working late into the night by flickering oil lamps. Oh, and did I mention child labor? Child labor wasn't just accepted in ancient Rome. It was necessary for family survival. Children as young as 6 or 7 were put to work helping with farming, herding animals, or assisting in workshops. Education was for the wealthy children only. Peasant children learned by working alongside their parents. The work was dangerous, and injuries were common. A broken leg, a bad cut, or a serious illness often meant economic disaster for the entire family. There was no disability insurance, no sick leave, and no social safety net. If you couldn't work, you starved and your family would suffer terribly. Job security didn't exist either. Bad weather, economic downturns, or the whims of wealthy landowners could leave peasant families destitute overnight. Many peasants lived just one bad harvest away from complete poverty. Have I mentioned that life sucked for peasants in ancient Rome? Well, now I have. Peasant social life. When Netflix and chill meant storytelling by candlelight. Social life for Roman peasants was drastically different from our modern understanding of leisure and entertainment. When your days are spent in grueling physical labor just to survive, socializing was a luxury that had to be squeezed into the small spaces between work and sleep. The center of peasant social life was often the local tavern, called a taberna, though even this was a far cry from the cozy pub experience you might enjoy today. These were rough, dimly lit places, where peasants could buy cheap wine and socialize after long days of work. But here's the catch. Most peasants couldn't afford to drink there regularly. A night at the tavern was a rare treat, usually reserved for special occasions or festivals. Religious festivals provided some of the few opportunities for peasants to socialize and have fun. Rome had numerous religious holidays throughout the year, and during these times, peasants could participate in public celebrations, watch performances, and sometimes even receive free food from wealthy benefactors trying to curry favor with the gods and the people. These festivals were like ancient Rome's version of free outdoor concerts, minus the food trucks and portaloos. Family gatherings were important, but limited. Extended families often lived in the same general area, so grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins would gather whenever possible. But this usually meant during major religious holidays or significant life events like births, marriages, and deaths. Marriage and relationships operated very differently than today. Peasant marriages were often arranged and were more about economic survival than romance. Families would arrange marriages that made economic sense, combining small plots of land, sharing resources, or ensuring that there were enough hands to do the work. Love was nice if it happened, but it wasn't the primary consideration for Roman peasants. Entertainment was mostly do-it-yourself. Peasants couldn't afford to attend the elaborate gladiator games or theatrical performances that the wealthy enjoyed. Instead, they made their own entertainment, storytelling, simple music with basic instruments, and folk dancing during festivals. Think of it as ancient Rome's version of a talent show, except everyone was both the performer and the audience. Community support was crucial for survival. Peasant communities developed informal networks of mutual aid, helping each other during harvest time, sharing resources during difficult periods, and providing support during family crises. This wasn't charity. It was a survival strategy. You helped your neighbors because you knew you might need their help next month. Yes, life really did suck for peasants in ancient Rome. So there you have it, the brutal reality of peasant life in ancient Rome. No Instagram-worthy homes, no foodie culture, no fashion choices, no career opportunities, no social media to stay connected, and no protected childhood, and certainly no soy milk frappuccinos with a yummy pastry. Just daily survival in conditions that would make reality TV shows look like luxury vacation. So, the next time you're annoyed about your Wi-Fi being slow, your coffee being cold, or having to work late, remember the Roman peasants who would have considered your worst day to be a total walk in the park. Sometimes, a little historical perspective is all you need to appreciate just how good modern life is today. Even when you're convinced the world is about to implode, which it could well do given the madness that's happening around the world, it's enough to give Nero a run for his money, and that's saying something, isn't it? If you enjoyed this journey with me, Marcus Aurelius, then please subscribe to this channel and you'll never miss another episode of Ancient Rome Revisited. I love recalling just how wonderful life was for me and all my wealthy friends in ancient Rome. Oh, well, sorry, hang on. I'm getting a bit sidetracked, aren't I? What I meant to say is that I love recalling all the trials and tribulations of my once great empire. If you want to learn more about life in ancient Rome, then you can find me in all the videos of Ancient Rome Revisited. I look forward to seeing you there.